My name is Jeremy Ayers, and I'm reading A Guide to the History of Slavery in Maryland by Ira Berlin, published in 2008. From the colony's founding in 1634 until the state abolished slavery in 1864, enslaved Africans and African Americans were important in shaping Maryland's history. The commodities they produced provided the foundation for Maryland's economy and formed its society. Slaves labored on the tobacco plantations that fueled the colony's economic growth during the 17th and 18th centuries. The fortunes amassed from the labor of enslaved workers allowed Maryland's gentry to dominate colonial politics and propelled some to national prominence. By the 19th century, slaves could be found in every corner of Maryland. Slaves labored in Cecil County's iron furnaces. Enslaved farmhands harvested wheat in Washington County, and skilled slave artisans like Frederick Douglass caulked ships in Baltimore's harbor. During the Civil War, African Americans reclaimed their freedom, but the weight of slavery's history was not easily obliterated, as slavery continued to cast a long shadow over the state. Blacks have endured poverty and discrimination into the 21st century. Slavery's influence can still be felt, as the recent debates about the state song and reparations demonstrate. In 2000, recognizing slavery's importance to Maryland's history, the legislature created the Commission to coordinate the study, commemoration, and impact of slavery's history and legacy. 7 years later, both houses of Maryland legislature and the Annapolis City Council officially expressed their, quote, regret for the role Maryland played in instituting and maintaining slavery, end quote. As the official apologies affirm, slavery is now recognized as a great crime, but for most of human history, few considered it either illegal or immoral. Slavery flourished in ancient Greece and Rome and was recognized by the Bible, Quran, and other sacred texts. Customs and law in Africa, Europe, and the Americas justified slavery and the trade in human beings. When Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans came together in the 15th century, each had knowledge of the institution of chattel bondage. Familiar with slavery and accustomed to a world of social hierarchies, the people of Africa, Europe, and the Americas sold slaves and purchased them without fear of violating either the laws of God or of man. To the European colonists who settled in Maryland, the enslavement of Africans and sometimes Native Americans, and the establishment of a society based upon slave labor required no special justification. They acted in a manner familiar to men and women throughout the Atlantic world of their day. Over time, slavery wore many faces in Maryland. The lives of enslaved black men and women in 1650 bore little resemblance to those living in 1750 or 1850. Slaves living in different parts of the state had diverse experiences, and former slaves often commented on slavery's diversity. George Ross, who had been enslaved near Hagerstown, highlighted one of the differences between northern and southern Maryland when he observed, down in Prince George's County, they are a little harder than they are in the upper part of the state. A Guide to the History of Slavery in Maryland traces slavery's history from the founding of George and Cecil Calvert's colony through the American Civil War, and is organized around three broad questions. Why did Maryland's landholders shift from a reliance on indentured servants to slaves in the late 17th century, and what were the implications of that shift? How and why did slavery evolve during the 17th and 18th centuries? Why did slavery decline following the American Revolution, and how did that decline shape Maryland society during the 19th century? In considering these questions, this guide also examines how enslaved men and women navigated the difficult years of bondage, and how, in the process, they created families and communities, institutions and ideologies which, when the moment arrived, allowed them to seize their freedom. The beginnings of Maryland slavery. On November 2nd, 1633, English colonists sailed for the Chesapeake Bay, where George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, had requested 10 million acres to establish a colony. Crammed into the Ark and the Dove, these settlers survived a harrowing Atlantic passage. Their arrival in the winter of 1634 marked the beginning of permanent European settlement in Maryland, but not the beginnings of slavery, which was already well ensconced in the Western Hemisphere. By 1634, a plantation system that employed enslaved labor to grow exotic crops, tobacco, rice, coffee, and, most importantly, sugar, for an international market flourished throughout the Atlantic world. During the 3 centuries prior to Columbus's arrival in the New World, Europeans established plantations in and around the Mediterranean, crossed the Great Ocean, and gained a foothold on the coast of Brazil and then in the Antilles. Though planters cared little about the nationality or race of their slaves, they became increasingly dependent upon Africans. Thus, long before the settlement of Maryland, the plantation system based on enslaved African labor had been established. Despite slavery's importance to the economies of other New World colonies, the institution remained marginal in Maryland during most of the 17th century. Indentured English and Irish servants outnumbered enslaved Africans until the 1690s. Black people comprised a small minority, less than 10% of the colony's population. Moreover, not all of these were slaves. Some labored as indentured servants, and others had gained their freedom. Historians have labeled the colony's black men and women Atlantic Creoles because of their origins in the larger Atlantic world. Most came from the Caribbean islands, while some were born elsewhere in the Americas. Many spoke English, practiced Christianity, and were familiar with English law and trading etiquettes. Matthias de Sousa, a man of mixed racial origins, accompanied Father Andrew White, one of the first settlers to Maryland. Now I'm going to show you an artist's rendering of Matthias de Sousa. Another of the early black arrivals, John Batista, successfully petitioned the Maryland Provincial Court for his freedom in 1653. Although purchased as laborers and worked hard by their owners, these Atlantic Creoles formed families, joined churches, and incorporated themselves into Maryland society. Living and working alongside white indentured servants, and trading among themselves and with others, both free and enslaved, they accumulated property. Like de Sousa and Batiste, they secured their freedom. In 1676, Thomas Hagelton, who was born in Africa but spent time in England, won his freedom in court. Others purchased their liberty, and many more received it as a gift from their owners. Free black men and women also migrated into the colony from Virginia. Together, such men and women composed Black Maryland's charter generation. The Plantation Revolution. The last decade of the 17th century witnessed a profound transformation of Maryland society, and with it, a change in the character of slavery. In 1689, following a revolt against Calvert family rule, Maryland planters took control of the colony. consolidated their grip on political power, expanded their land holdings, and increased their need for laborers. At the same time, economic and political developments in Europe disrupted the supply of indentured servants, prompting planters to turn to African labor, most of it imported directly from the continent. So I'm going to show you a picture of Africans being led into a slave ship. The end of the English Royal Africans Company's slave trade monopoly in 1698 also made it easier for Maryland planters to obtain Africans. African slavery, which had been legalized in a series of laws starting in the 1660s, grew rapidly, and black slaves replaced white indentured servants as the primary source of plantation labor. The nature of the transatlantic slave trade changed. Slaves no longer dribbled into Maryland in small numbers, carrying knowledge of the languages, religions, and trading etiquette of the larger Atlantic world. Rather, they entered the colony by the boatful, stuffed into the holds of ships under the grimmest of conditions. While fewer than 1,000 Africans arrived in Maryland between 1619 and 1697, nearly 100,000 disembarked during the 3/4 of a century prior to the American Revolution. By 1755, about 1/3 of Maryland's population, in some places as much as 1/2, was derived from Africa, mostly from the interior of the continent. The colony became as much an extension of Africa as of Europe. The men and women dragged across the Atlantic were called Africans, but they were not Africans when they boarded the slave ships. Rather, they were members of particular nations. Angolans, Igbos, and Mande, for example, each with its own political hierarchy, social structure, traditions, and culture. Some were matriarchal and others patriarchal. Some Africans labored as farmers, worked as village-based artisans or merchants, or served as soldiers. Most had been free, but some had been slaves. They wove different kinds of cloth, made different kinds of pottery, smelted different kinds of metals, sang different songs, and worshipped different gods. For the most part, Maryland planters cared little about the origins of their slaves, and those who did had but small ability to get the slaves they wanted. Nonetheless, the workings of the international trade gave Maryland slaves a unique national or ethnic profile. Although Africans who came to Maryland derived from all parts of the continent, the vast majority, some 3/4, originated in the Windward and Gold Coasts of West Africa. In particular, Igbo culture deeply influenced black life in the colony. The advent of the slave plantation, what has been called the Tobacco Revolution, had a devastating effect on black life in Maryland. And here you can see slaves working on a tobacco plantation, or tobacco farm. Members of the charter generation decamped or were swallowed by the massive wave of African imports. Under the new system, few black people gained their freedom, and in the half century prior to the American Revolution, the proportion of black people enjoying freedom declined from 1 in 4 to 1 in 25. Planters put the newly arrived Africans to work in primitive inland plantations, where the largely male population lived lonely lives without friends or families. Driven to work at a feverish pace, slaves suffered grievously. Deadly diseases, for which newly arrived Africans had little resistance, killed them at a murderous rate. The sexually imbalanced population, in part a product of the planters' preference for slave men, could not form families. During the first decades of the 18th century, the fertility rate of the black population declined and its mortality rate increased as the harsh regimen of tobacco agriculture transformed Maryland into a chattel house, a charnel house for black people. Violence, isolation, exhaustion, and alienation led African slaves to profound depression and occasionally self destruction. But enslaved people also contested the new regime. Resistance took a variety of forms. Slaves refused to accept the names given to them by their owners, secretly retaining their African names and customs. Some slaves ran away, often moving toward the back country in large groups to establish African society in the New World. Others paddled into the Atlantic, pointing their canoes eastward toward Africa. Some confronted their owners directly in bloody frays. Yet others used guile rather than their muscle. They destroyed livestock and farm equipment and feigned ignorance, leading one English visitor to proclaim, "Let 100 men show him how to hoe, or drive a wheelbarrow, and he'll still take the one by the bottom and the other by the wheel." Yet, despite their best efforts, slaves could not topple the planters' regime. There are slave families on a plantation. Africans to African Americans. Sometime during the 1740s, Maryland slavery began to change yet again. This transformation, nearly invisible at first, would permanently reshape black life in Maryland. As enslaved Africans developed immunity to the diseases of the Americas, they lived longer. Planters, seeing the advantage of an indigenous reproducing labor force, imported women as well as men, so that the ratio of men and women in the slave population struck an even balance. As the sex ratio flattened, black men and women again established families. Planters gave women some time off during the last trimester of pregnancy, and the black population began to increase naturally. With the growth of an African American population, planters relied less on the transatlantic slave trade to replenish their labor force. By the middle of the 18th century, few Africans were entering the colony, and the black population was largely native born. Maryland lawmakers officially ended the colony's participation in the international slave trade in 1774, but in fact, the trade had all but ceased by mid-century. On the eve of the American Revolution, 90% of the colony's enslaved population was native born, and black people completed the process of transforming themselves from Africans to African Americans. African American slaves differed from their African forebears in important ways. Fluent in English and familiar with the countryside, they developed skills that propelled some into the artisan class and allowed them to create their own small independent economies. The so-called slave economy, raising stock and barnyard fowl, working gardens and provision grounds and crafting baskets, pots, and other saleable items provided the material basis for slave community life. Families knit themselves into networks of kin that spread across the Maryland countryside, creating complex social connections, patterns of belief, and recognized leaders. Slave life in Maryland in the 17th and 18th centuries. Tobacco as our staple is our all, and indeed leaves no room for anything else, wrote Benedict Leonard Calvert in 1729. More than any single aspect of slave life, the cultivation of tobacco shaped the experience of Maryland's black people. Since tobacco could only be grown in small patches, planters divided their slaves into small squads and spread them out across the countryside. Although the great slave owners maintained large home plantations with great houses and numerous outbuildings that housed artisan shops of all sorts, most agricultural laborers worked and lived in small units called quarters that were scattered about Maryland's landscape. Here's one of those large plantation mansions called Hampton. And here's a picture of a burial ceremony among slaves. Tobacco exhausted the soil, so these quarters had to move frequently. The mobility of the slave quarter and the small size of units of production meant that the slaves were always on the move. Visiting was a common occurrence among the enslaved, especially since many husbands and wives lived in separate quarters. Although quarters were often supervised by a white overseer, planters frequently turned their management over to an elderly or trusted slave. The presence of slave patriarchs or matriarchs on the quarters increased the independence of enslaved blacks, allowing them a great degree of control over their domestic and religious lives. Joining the memory of Africa with the circumstances of life in Maryland, African Americans began to create their own society, different from that of Africa and different than that of their white overlords, but connected to both. The unique character of African American life could be seen in all aspects of slave culture, from the way black people prepared their food to the way they buried their dead. Evidence from slave cemeteries suggests that slave communities used the burial of a loved one as a time to assert their collective identity, create bonds among themselves, and reestablish links to remembered African customs. The Revolution in Black Life. The American Revolution again transformed the lives of African Americans in Maryland. Although slavery survived the upheaval unleashed by the Revolutionary War, the institution of chattel bondage underwent sweeping changes as Maryland became a state in the new American Republic. Amid the turmoil, black men and women found opportunities to challenge slavery and regain their freedom. Military necessity forced the opposing armies to seek black military laborers and soldiers. Recognizing slavery's importance to the Chesapeake's economy and the potential value of black soldiers, the British government acted first. In Early November 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation that offered freedom to the indentured servants and slaves of rebellious planters. Although a number of enslaved black men and women who responded to Dunmore's proclamation was small, historians estimate that fewer than 1,000 slaves escaped under the governor's edict. His order echoed throughout the Chesapeake. While their masters denounced British tyranny, slaves renounced their owners by flocking to British lines, where they found refuge and freedom. The approach of British forces encouraged bondsmen and women to escape. In 1780, when British warships sailed into the Chesapeake, a desperate planter wrote to Maryland Governor Thomas Sim Lee, cautioning that if a stop is not put to these cruisers, I am convinced that all our most valuable Negroes will run away. Indeed, by the end of the American Revolution, some 5,000 Chesapeake slaves had escaped to the British. Here are some slaves who are responding to the proclamation and joining the British. Many of these slaves enlisted in the military struggle against their former owners. In Virginia, Lord Dunmore organized fugitive slave men into an Ethiopian regiment, which battled American forces in 1775 and 1776. Others waged a guerrilla war against slaveholders. On the eastern shore, fugitive slaves joined bands of marauding outlaws, many of whom were white, and attacked plantations. Here are slaves who are escaping, taken in the eastern shore of Maryland. Where they live. American military officers and politicians were slow to recruit slaves or even free blacks. Maryland's tobacco planters had invested heavily in slavery, and they were reluctant to surrender their valued property or take actions that might threaten slavery's survival. By 1780, however, military necessity forced them to reconsider. Unable to recruit enough white soldiers for continental and state service, the legislature agreed to accept slave volunteers, provided that they had their owner's permission. The following spring, Maryland lawmakers subjected free blacks to the draft. Changes on the battlefield soon affected life on Maryland's plantations and farms. Slaves became increasingly unruly, and fear of slave insurrections shot through the slaveholding class. The slaveholders' authority, once absolute, unraveled as slaves encountered black and white outlaws, marauding redcoats, and American recruiting officers. Declining commodity prices, which ruined many planters and rendered them unable to clothe and feed their slaves, further weakened the master's authority. As conditions on the plantations worsened, many slaves fled. Other changes that accompanied the war transformed slave life. The disruption of international tobacco markets forced planters to become more self-sufficient. Unable to purchase British manufactured goods, planters trained slave men and women to fashion barrels, weave cloth, and smelt iron. The skills that enslaved artisans acquired during the American Revolution imbued them with a new confidence. Some hired their own labor with, and sometimes without, their owners' permissions. Planters also turned from tobacco to the production of foodstuffs, growing corn and small grains. Mixed farming required fewer slaves than tobacco monoculture, encouraging slaveholders to sell some slaves, hire others, and occasionally free others. Slavery and freedom in the new nation. The combined pressure of the American Revolution and the decline of the tobacco economy forced Maryland's lawmakers to consider slavery's place in the new republic. To the north, slavery was fast collapsing under the weight of the egalitarian promise of the Declaration of Independence. Even before the war ended, constitutional conventions, legislatures, and courts abolished slavery in New England. Lawmakers in Pennsylvania passed a gradual abolition act in 1780, and after considerable delay, New York and New Jersey followed. Anti-slavery forces, a combination of evangelical and secular egalitarians, pressed their case in Maryland, bringing the question to the floor of the state legislature several times in the 1780s and 1790s. Slavery survived abolitionist challenges in Maryland, but it did not survive unscathed. When the state refused to act, individuals moved on their own. Manumissions increased during the 1780s and grew even more numerous when, in 1790, the legislature allowed slaveholders to free their slaves by will as well as deed. Successful escape itself became easier as the number of black people enjoying freedom grew. The greatly enlarged free black population aided friends and relatives in the purchase of their liberty, and when that was not possible, they often assisted them in making their escape. Emboldened by revolutionary ideology, newly freed blacks pressed for greater civil and political rights, publishing a plea for freedom on May 15th, 1783, in the Maryland Gazette, a few months before the removal of the United States Capitol to Annapolis. In Baltimore, free black Thomas Brown campaigned for the Maryland House of Delegates. Although he was defeated, Brown's bid for office suggests the powerful impact of the American Revolution. Indeed, Brown based his campaign on his commitment to the revolutionary movement. In a letter to Baltimore's voters, Brown noted that he had been a zealous patriot in the cause of liberty during the late struggle for freedom and independence, not fearing prison or death for my country's cause. Still, at century's end, slavery remained deeply entrenched in Maryland, and slaveholders continued to be a powerful force in the state's economic and political life. As abolitionist sentiment waned, the defenders of slavery seized the initiative. The legislature strengthened slavery and circumscribed free blacks' liberty. Fearing that free blacks would subvert the extant racial order, legislators enacted a series of laws that limited their civil and political rights. In 1796, the General Assembly prohibited free blacks from testifying in freedom suits. That same year, the legislature passed strict vagrancy laws, allowing county governments to sell unemployed free blacks into terms of servitude and to apprentice their children to white planters. 6 years later, lawmakers disenfranchised black men. There would be no Thomas Browns in the Maryland State House. The War of 1812 in the Chesapeake. By the 1820s, the revolutionary upheaval that had moved the state to the edge of abolition was becoming a distant memory. But as the nation edged towards another war with Britain, black people, enslaved and free, again sensed new opportunities to appropriate their freedom. When British forces sailed into the Chesapeake Bay in 1813, black men and women seized the main chance. British warships attracted hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves. An estimated 3,000 to 5,000 Maryland and Virginia slaves fled to the British, and Maryland's leaders again feared for slavery's future. While Maryland planters fretted about the growing number of fugitives, the British enlisted them as pioneers and guides. On Tangier Island, they trained a small corps of colonial marines, consisting entirely of escaped slaves. Here's George Roberts, who served aboard the Chasseur in the War of 1812. These soldiers fought in numerous actions against American forces and were praised for, quote, their great spirit and vivacity and perfect obedience, and their extraordinary steadiness and good conduct when in action against the enemy, end quote. A Washington newspaper reported that fugitive slaves became pilots, while a British officer noted that former slaves often exclaimed, "Me free man, me got cut massa's throat, give me musket." At war's end, 3,000 to 5,000 black men and women received their freedom from the British. However, in the years that followed, they faced a difficult struggle. A handful of refugees, including the colonial marines, was sent to Bermuda, where they served at an English naval base, while others found homes in the West Indies. The largest group of refugees, some 2,000 former slaves, took refuge in Nova Scotia. Some of these men and women would later migrate to England, and then to the new colony of Sierra Leone on the coast of West Africa. Maryland diaspora. Changes in black life accelerated after the War of 1812, increasing in velocity during the remainder of the 19th century. Black Marylanders, freed and enslaved, were uprooted in the Second Middle Passage and scattered throughout the North American continent and the larger Atlantic world. In some cases, these migrations were voluntary. The abolition of slavery in the northern states encouraged many to follow the North Star. By the outbreak of the Civil War, thousands of black Marylanders had settled in the United States and Canada. The law was used to curtail the unauthorized flight to freedom. Samuel Green, an itinerant Methodist minister from Maryland's eastern shore, who helped his sons escape to Canada, was sentenced to 10 years in the Maryland Penitentiary for owning a copy of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Other black men and women sailed off to Africa, settling in a portion of the new colony of Liberia called Maryland in Africa. Yet not all black Marylanders left the state voluntarily. Instead, they were forcibly deported and relocated in the American Southwest by migrating planters and slave traders. The Industrial Revolution that swept across Europe and the northern United States created an insatiable demand for cotton. Lured by fertile land and the promise of great profits, planters from the seaboard states migrated south to meet that demand and made fortunes growing cotton. The Cotton Revolution created a seemingly limitless demand for slave labor in the Southwest. Slave prices soared, and Maryland newspapers reported that throughout the entire South there is a great demand for slaves, and enormous prices are paid for them. By 1850, slave dealers were offering between $1,200 and $1,600 for healthy young men. With the tobacco economy sagging and slavery losing its profitability, Maryland's slaveholders saw opportunity in the sale of slaves south. By 1830 and 1860, they sold an estimated 200,000 they sold an estimated 20,000 slaves to the cotton planters of the Southwest. The interstate slave trade had a devastating impact on black families. As the coffles trudged south, slave husbands and wives came to appreciate the fragility of the marriage bond, and slave parents learned their children would disappear, never to be seen again. Sales south shattered approximately one slave marriage in three and separated one-fifth of the children under 14 from one or both of their parents. I have seen hundreds of cases where families were separated, recalled one Maryland slave. I have heard them cry, fit to break their hearts. Slaves struggled to keep their families intact, pleading with their owners to respect the sanctity of their households and, when that failed, threatening violence and flight. Some slaveholders yielded to their slaves' appeals, others did not. All, however, respected the slaves' threats, especially those within reach of the free states. According to one former slave, Maryland's location made slave masters reluctant to act because it was so near the northern states. Indeed, the ability of Maryland slaves to follow the lead of Frederick Douglass, to get on a train in Baltimore as a slave and disembark in Philadelphia as a free man, made the slaveholders into supplicants. When Harry Dale escaped from slavery, his frustrated owner placed a newspaper advertisement promising Dale that if he will return home, I hereby pledge myself to let him choose a master if he does not wish to live with me. As the possibilities of bargaining with their owners increased, slaves entered into agreements that allowed them to buy their freedom. Delayed manumission, or term slavery, agreements under which slaveholders pledged themselves to free their slaves after a certain number of years of loyal service, weakened the power of the owners, but did nothing to alleviate the harsh realities of African American life, free or slave. Black life in the 19th century countryside. During the 19th century, Maryland's economy and political culture fractured along regional lines. In the state's northern and western counties, farmers became increasingly dependent upon diversified agriculture, in which slavery played a diminishing role. On the eastern shore, soil exhaustion and declining tobacco prices forced farmers to abandon tobacco, manumit their slaves, and cultivate their farms with free black and white farmhands. In the state's southern counties, however, tobacco and slavery remained the cornerstones of the agricultural economy, and planters retained their considerable economic and political might. The effects of these divisions grew more pronounced with time, so that the circumstances and aspirations of black people in different regions diverged sharply. As they lived and worked alongside white non slaveholders and free blacks, slaves became a diminishing portion of northern Maryland's mobile and flexible workforce. Farmers raising cereals and corn did not want to support workers throughout the year. Instead, they hired workers during planting and harvesting seasons, then discharged the unneeded. In such an economy, slaves were a liability, not an asset. Northern Maryland's slave population then entered into a steady decline. In Washington County, the slave population peaked at 3,201 in 1820 and fell precipitously to 1,435 in 1860. A similar pattern emerged in Cecil County, where the slave population plummeted from 3,407 in 1790 to 950 in 1860. So dramatic was slavery's decline in the non tobacco producing counties that one observer wrote, "In the grain and pastoral counties of Cecil and Allegheny, slavery appears to be undergoing a gradual extinction." The decline of slavery also informed all aspects of black life on Maryland's eastern shore. The region's slaves seldom worked in large gangs, but labored independently or in small groups, often alongside their owners, white farmhands, and free blacks. Slaves performed a variety of tasks during the growing season. Winter found slaves chopping firewood, slaughtering livestock, threshing grain, and hauling produce to markets in Baltimore and Washington. During the spring, summer, and fall, slaves planted corn, mowed grasses, tended livestock, and harvested crops. While performing these tasks, enslaved blacks required numerous skills and knowledge of the countryside. Slaves found opportunities to hire themselves, which allowed a considerable measure of independence. Now I'm going to show you a picture of Nancy Campbell from Washington County, who was manumitted. Independence, however, came with a price. Because the region's slave holdings were small, slaves could not forge communities and families on their home farms, and often endured long separations from their friends and families. Like the black family, the black community was not defined by the boundaries of farms or plantations, but spread extensively over entire neighborhoods. Black communities often coalesced in the region's towns and meeting places, where slaves and free blacks gathered to socialize and worship on holidays and weekends. In Hagerstown, for example, the constable noted that the town's white residents were
very much aggrieved from the great concourse of negroes that frequently infest the public square, especially on Sabbath day. Southern Maryland presented a stark contrast to the state's grain producing counties. Tobacco and slavery retained their vigor, as evidenced by census returns. In 1850, Maryland's southern counties, Anne Arundel, Calvert, Charles, Prince George's, and Montgomery, were home to 50,000 whites, 9,500 free blacks, and over 48,000 slaves. In many ways, slave life remained unchanged between the 18th and 19th centuries. The relentless demands of tobacco production dominated workers' lives. Slaves continued to labor in large gangs under an overseer's lash. They had less independence and fewer opportunities to acquire skills, seek outside employment, or purchase their freedom than their counterparts elsewhere. The economic divisions within Maryland ignited an intense debate about slavery's continued viability. Agricultural reformers argued that slavery was an outmoded, inefficient system that stunted Maryland's prosperity, pointing to the declining white population in the state's southern counties. Slavery's enemies claimed that the peculiar institution discouraged white immigrants and chased their sons and daughters from the state. These opponents of slavery hoped that gradual emancipation would attract white farmers and wage laborers. The diminished use of slave labor leaves many vacant farms and many large and uncultivated tracts of land, wrote one reformer, which must, from the unprofitableness of slave labor, only be cultivated by free white labor. Slaveholders were reluctant to abandon their human property, but they found their position increasingly untenable. Declining tobacco prices, soil exhaustion, and their decreasing authority over their bondsmen and women forced many planters to consider emancipation. Although slavery remained important to the state's southern counties, it declined elsewhere in the state. Black life in Baltimore in the 19th century. Recalling his childhood in Baltimore, Frederick Douglass noted a marked difference between his treatment in the city and the country. A city slave is almost a freeman, compared with a slave on the plantation, Douglass wrote. He is much better fed and clothed, and enjoys privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation. Although African Americans faced crushing poverty and hostility from their white neighbors, Douglass's remarks accurately reflected the lives of many enslaved black people in Baltimore. From the founding of the city, black workers, free and enslaved, played a critical role in the city's economy, especially its maritime sector. They worked the city's warehouses and wharves, labored in shops that produced ropes, sails, and barrels, and constructed ships in Baltimore's sprawling shipyards. The widespread opportunities for employment made Baltimore a haven for fugitive slaves from the surrounding counties who could find work with few questions asked. The growing number of free blacks who might shelter a fugitive only made Baltimore that much more attractive as a destination for runaways. The steady erosion of slavery sent chattel bondage into a decline from which it never recovered. By 1860, Baltimore's African American population had swelled to 27,000, over 90% of whom enjoyed legal freedom. Black Baltimoreans organized their community around a variety of civic and religious organizations. The thick web of associations provided Black people with education, spiritual guidance, and a measure of economic security. Many were the product of white exclusivity. Denied entry to the city's public schools, Black men and women created their own, such as the Watkins Academy for Negro Youth, which the noted poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper attended through the age of 14. Here's a picture of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. But other Black institutions had their origins in the unique experience and needs of Black people. Benevolent and fraternal societies protected members against illness, unemployment, and injury, or and assured a decent burial at death. Black men organized Freemason and Order of Oddfellows lodges, and joined with Black women to create a host of literary societies and lyceums. The heart of the Black community was, however, the city's African American churches. Here is the Saratoga Street African Baptist Chapel in Baltimore. Beginning with Daniel Coker in the 1790s, Baltimore's Black leaders played a critical role in establishing the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Such churches provided the foundation for the city's Black community. Church buildings served as schools, halls for social gatherings, and platforms for political mobilization. By the eve of the Civil War, Baltimore Blacks had created some 24 churches of various denominations. Jubilee, Civil War, and Emancipation. First of all, we'll look at Reverend Daniel Coker, who I mentioned earlier, was instrumental in establishing the churches there that became community centers. At the outbreak of the Civil War in the spring of 1861, Maryland's elected officials steered a difficult course between persevering the Union and protecting slavery. As Governor Thomas H. Hicks declared, "I care nothing for the devilish N-word difficulty. I desire to save the Union and will cooperate with the administration in everything to that important result that is proper." While slaveholders struggled to retain their slaves, slaves chafed under their owners' authority and clamored for their freedom. Their unrelenting demands for liberty destabilized slavery and forced the state's political leaders, most of them slaveholders, grudgingly to embrace emancipation. The arrival of federal soldiers during the first year of the war presented Maryland's slaves with numerous opportunities to escape from bondage. When a train carrying Union soldiers passed through Frederick, slaves secreted themselves aboard and escaped. Similarly, the encampment of federal soldiers near Hagerstown allowed one enterprising slave to flee from his owner, hire himself to a Northern officer, and begin his life as a free man. But the Lincoln administration, fearful that Maryland would desert the Union for the Confederacy, remained committed to the preservation of slavery through 1861 and into 1862. Still, the outbreak of the Civil War heralded the beginning of slavery's demise. Opportunities for escape abounded. Although slaves yet had no legal guarantee to liberty, they claimed it nonetheless. Writing to his wife from a federal camp, John Boston, a former Maryland slave, proclaimed, "This day I can address you, thank God, as a free man. I am free from the slaver's lash." Some federal officers were sympathetic toward the state's slaveholders, but most lost patience with slave owners, more concerned for their property than for the Union. They grew increasingly reluctant to return fugitives to their secessionist masters. Fugitive slaves, or contrabands, were valuable military laborers and servants, and soldiers recognized their importance to the cause. Soldiers assaulted and intimidated slaveholders who came into their encampments searching for fugitives. When a Charles County planter ventured into a federal camp, the soldiers surrounded him, screaming, "Shoot him! Bayonet him! Kill him! Pitch him out!" and pelted him with stones. Slavery was on the defensive. The federal government's slow march towards emancipation strained slavery in Maryland. When Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia in April 1862, Maryland slaves found another safe harbor. Slaves from the countryside flocked to Washington, where they found employment laboring for the Army and Navy and in military hospitals. Here's a man, we don't know his name, that served in the Union Army. It was but a short step from employing fugitive slaves to freeing them and allowing slave men to serve as soldiers in federal ranks, which Abraham Lincoln did in his Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. Lincoln excluded Maryland from the proclamation, but the president's edict nonetheless emboldened the state's enslaved blacks. "Our slaves are walking off every day," observed a Baltimore newspaper. "The slightest coercion to compel moderate labor, and they are seized with the desire to walk off to a free state." Before long, black men from Maryland had their chance to enlist in the Union Army. Soldiering provided the acid that dissolved slavery in the state. Federal recruiters demanded access to the state's black population, enlisting enslaved men by the thousands. Slaveholders opposed the enlistment of their slaves, despite the bounty they would be paid. Still, the policy found many white supporters, as slaves counted towards the state's draft quotas, thus saving white men from the draft. The small and middling-sized farmers who employed free black workers had little liking for a policy that enlisted their workers while leaving the planters' labor force intact. By late 1863, many of the most die-hard slave owners had conceded that slavery was beyond repair, and however reluctantly, accepted its demise. The willingness of Maryland slaves to exchange slavery for military service proved them right. Given the opportunity, slave men filled the ranks of Maryland's segregated regiments and joined the crusade against slavery. In November 1864, Maryland ratified a new constitution prohibiting slavery. And here we have a slave nurse with a child. and in 1865, freedmen arriving in Baltimore with their families. Emancipation was not the final chapter in the long story of slavery in Maryland. For more than 200 years, slavery stood at the core of Maryland life. Slaves grew the tobacco, harvested the wheat, dug the coal, and smelted the iron upon which Maryland's economy rested. They helped build the C&O Canal and the B&O Railroad. They cared for and taught the children of their white owners. Slaves informed the struggle over freedom that gave the American Revolution and the Civil War their cosmic meaning. The determination of black men and women to maintain their humanity in the face of great inhumanity and force others to accept it transformed not only their lives, but the lives of all Marylanders. The struggle for equal rights and opportunity would continue long after emancipation. In Maryland, efforts at re-enslaving young black men and women throughout a revival of a particularly onerous indentured servitude sanctioned by the Orphans' Court was reversed through the use of the writ of habeas corpus in the federal courts. In Ex parte, Elizabeth Turner, 1867, a precedent which followed in principle Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney's Ex parte Merryman, Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase struck down an attempt to keep Elizabeth Turner in bondage. The battle for full, unfettered citizenship was far from over, however. Integration and enforcement of civil rights would not come for another century, standing as a lesson to all that moving from principle to practice in a democracy requires persistent vigilance and civic engagement at all levels and branches of government. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave black people a right to vote. Here is a parade in celebration in Baltimore. And we know that Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery, so we'll read a little bit about her. In 1822, Harriet Tubman is born in Dorchester County, Maryland. Here's a picture of Harriet Tubman. In 1825, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, we talked about her, was born. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escapes from slavery. In the years that follow, she mounts numerous missions into Maryland's eastern shore to lead enslaved blacks to freedom. And then finally, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. And then in 1870, the 15th Amendment is ratified, granting voting rights to all black men. Maryland does not vote to ratify. 1895, on February 20th, Frederick Douglass died. 1913, on March 10th, Harriet Tubman died in Auburn, New York. 1953, on April 13th, Harriet Tubman's restored home in Auburn, New York is memorialized by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. 1859, April 28th, Maryland Senate ratifies the 14th Amendment, which was
validating citizenship rights for peoples born and naturalized in the United States. In 1988, recognized as the Frederick Douglass Home by the National Park Service in 1962, the abolitionists' Washington, D.C. house is redesignated as the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site on February 12th. And then in 2006, on January 6th, Montgomery County Planning Board agrees to buy the property, an acre of land, on which the slave cabin Josiah Henson lived in now exists. And this is that cabin of Josiah Henson. In 2007, Maryland resolutions of apology for slavery are approved. On May 8, 2007, the Honorable Thomas V. Mike Miller Jr., the President of the Senate, and the Honorable Michael E. Bush, Speaker of the House of Delegates, signed Senate Joint Resolution 6 and House Resolution 4. On May 14, 2007, Mayor Ellen Moyer and the Annapolis City Council approved the resolution. And here's one last picture. We'll leave a picture of Harriet Tubman here. Hero, American hero, who rescued hundreds of people from Maryland. Even when she was free, she chose to return the possibility of being killed to rescue people in the eastern shore of Maryland, where we now live. And thank you. This has been the history of a guide to the history of slavery in Maryland by Ira Berlin.